us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to work together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Hi and welcome to another edition of Public Interest. We're so happy that you can join us today. I'm Gabriela Patram. With me as usual is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and leader of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome and thank you for joining us again.
So it's good to be here, Gabriela.
Sir, today's discussion is a little bit saddened and heartbreaking. We're going to be talking about the current natural disaster faced in Guyana, which is the flooding. I'm sure that you've been keeping abreast with everything. All of the regions have been affected, unfortunately. But we're in the May-June rains in Guyana, and they never fail. It happens like clockwork every year, and flooding always follows. However, this administration seems to have been caught unprepared for this year's May-June rains. Why is that, sir, in your view?
Well, as you say, the May-June rains never fail, and invariably there is flooding in some part of the country.
Yeah.
Some areas are more vulnerable than others, but the pattern is quite clear now, and the PPP has the notorious, reputation of having been in office 16 years ago, in 2005, which was the worst flood ever recorded in Guyana's history. So the PPP should have had the experience of dealing with these catastrophic floods. And I can't understand why they were unprepared. I mean, the May-June rains are like Christmas, they will come. There will be heavy rainfall. This year in particular, the rainfall has been maybe twice the previous year's average. And I can only surmise that the PPP was focused on other aspects of public administration. It is well known that the massive dismissals of public servants, the persecution of the people in high office, people in charge of major commissions, that seems to have absorbed the energy of the PPP. They're not paying much attention to the impending natural catastrophe that the floods have now become. They seem to be focused on concentrating state power, removing any persons or institutions which might obstruct their access to or their control of state power. So they're in a period of consolidation of state power. They've gotten into office on the 2nd of August. And their focus is not on development at all. It's all on, finding enemies, real or imagined, and holding on to power and ensuring that there are no slippages in the control of power. So when the rainfall came, they seemed to ignore it. They did not anticipate the situation we have now before us. So it is really remarkable that they should have gone through 30 years of government in this country. Don't forget, the PPP was in office from 1957 to 64. That's 7 years, from 1992 to 2015. Another 23 years. That's 30 years in office. And any intelligent political party would have been aware of the danger of flooding and the level of precipitation that is capable or that has occurred on the coast of Guyana. This year, of course, it's much worse because it's countrywide. So the PPP has to change its focus. It has to focus on national development. It has to focus on human, survivability, human resources, and getting the nation behind a national program for flood relief. This has not happened, and they're creating too many enemies, and they're failing to deal with the catastrophe before us.
And the people are suffering.
And the people are suffering, but the PPP is still bent on sending home more workers, as you see happening in GWI. And I think up till last week, we had over 1,700 dismissals, and they're continuing to dismiss people. But I'm sure that within a few weeks' time, it'll be 2,000, and they keep on consolidating their power and removing anyone who they feel is opposed to their power. But that's what they're onto. They're not onto dealing with the real causes of the current flood situation again. They're dealing with other issues, and I think they need to focus on the fact that we have two big problems in the country at present. One is the COVID-19 pandemic, and two is the flood crisis.
Sir, the floods this year, though, would have affected every region, particularly Region 10, Kokwani. We see Blackbush farmers in Region 6 being affected severely as well. I just got a moment this morning to scroll through Facebook, and I saw former Minister Hastings posted some photos to say that waters continue to rise in Region 7. Sir, what is responsible for the scale, the scope, and the seriousness of the flooding?
This is really a catastrophic situation. Now, there are several factors which are responsible for what you call the scale and scope, and the seriousness of the floods. One, there is climate change. The weather patterns have become more unpredictable and more catastrophic. Climate change is inevitable. We cannot escape from that. We have to plan for it. We have to seek strategies to mitigate the impact of climate change. Two, Guyana is the land of waters. And we have to have some drainage control scheme in place, some system, countrywide system, not only on the coastline, where we have the NDIA, but throughout the country, because we have a river system which are becoming clogged. For example, a river like the Pomeroon, you have to clear the outfalls. Canals, well, even the smaller rivers like Haika, Myconia, Barry, you have to clear the outfalls to make sure that when the rain falls, the floodwaters could run out more easily into the Atlantic. They always become silted up.
Okay.
So you need to look also at the canals to make sure the canals are kept clear, because if the canals are clogged up, you are going to have, flooding on the land. So the canal system is important, and those canals and the land have certain capacity. Once there's rainfall in Georgetown for more than 3 hours, if it gets to 5 hours, you're going to get flooding. And in several other areas, the land simply cannot absorb or drain off the amount of precipitation that's taking place. So you have to look at capacity as well. In particular, on the coastal zone, we know that there's a rising sea level. When there's high tide or spring tide, you're going to get flooding because the waters on the land cannot be drained off. But more than anything else, we need a national plan. There's no national plan. People, I'm sure, may not comprehend the seriousness of flooding in the Rupununi, which is influenced by the Amazonian river system, not the coastal river system. Sometimes it is dry on the coast, but Rupununi waters are rising because of the Rio Branco or whatever else is happening in northern Brazil. So those are some of the factors which need to be considered. And if we are to have, some form of relief or mitigation or even prevention of the catastrophic flooding that you're seeing now, there's no reason why, after so many years of independence, we should be suffering these floods. There needs to be a national plan, and there's no national plan.
Under this administration.
Under this administration. And this administration should know best what happened in 2005.
So on that same note, in for 2005, like we would have mentioned earlier, it was deemed the Great Floods of 2005.
The notorious flood of 2005. Nothing
And-
great about that.
Yeah, and the Brigadier administration was accused of mismanaging that period. It caused numerous deaths, the spread of diseases, and millions of dollars in damages, dislocation, and destruction. How similar is the PPP administration's response to this current flood to its reaction to the floods of 2005?
Well, the similarities are obvious. One, the unpreparedness. The evidence suggests that even in 2005, and by that time Mr. Jagdeo was in office for about 6 years, the farmers in East Demerara were complaining that almost on an annual basis, the Abari, Mahaika, and Maikoni rivers were flooding. The water would overflow the banks because the rivers were relatively narrow, narrow and shallow. And once the water coming from the conservancy exceeded a certain volume, it would run into the rice fields. So they knew that, since the 1990s, and very little was done. And it kept postponing it. There were other projects which they felt were more important, and they would pay the farmers compensation. It's like a car manufacturer which knows that the car has faults, but they decide to pay compensation instead of fix the problem. And this is what happened. Literally, after 2005, the Jagdeo administration was forced to build the Hope Canal, which it should have built maybe a decade earlier. And the Hope Canal, has taken some of the floodwaters off. There needs, as you know, even from colonial times, there were outlets along the Demerara, the East Bank Demerara. So I would say that the PPP at all material times knew what it had to do. And before 2005, and 16 years later, we are in the same position. The PPP has to put in place a national flood prevention scheme, countrywide scheme, not only for the coast, but also for the other regions, the hinterland regions, which are affected by riverine flooding, particularly Pomeroon suffers heavily. But now we're seeing situation developing in all of the other regions because of the heavy precipitation. So there is a clear similarity between the mismanagement of 2005 and the current mismanagement. I think some of the plans which the coalition made between 2015 and 2020 have been abandoned, criticized, set aside. And we are not getting relief. And there are so many similarities, and I just hope that we don't have the type of catastrophic precipitation that we had in 2005, because even with the Hope Canal, East Demerara will not be saved. And we're not talking about East Demerara alone. In 2005 it was just 3 regions, 3, 4, and 5, but this time it's 10 regions. And in areas like Region 7, you mentioned, I think people in Bartica are surprised. This is the first time that they've had such high waters in the township. Kukwani, of course, that's a catastrophe, and we need to have a change in the attitude. The PPP needs to change the attitude. It hasn't changed in 16 years from 2005 to now, and we hope that, however long they're around, they start to take flood control seriously.
And sir, where there is floods, there tends to be diseases rising. This administration would have underplayed the public health consequences of the floods of 2005 as well. What precautions have been taken to mitigate the public health impact of the floods during the current other health pandemic that we're going through, the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, well, it's a double whammy for the Guyanese citizens and the victims of the disease. many Guyanese are not aware of what happened in Region 3, 4, and 5 in 2005. That about 36 people died
Yeah.
and a few drowned. And there certainly was evidence of leptospirosis. We don't know how widespread other gastroenteric diseases were, maybe diarrhea and other waterborne diseases. We don't know to the extent that there was cholera. In fact, the PPP administration of the day never really conducted a serious investigation into causation, what caused the catastrophic flood. And in fact, there was no system. I think those persons who passed State House in 2005 would wonder what's going on. There was a one-man show. There was one person there, with containers and, controlling the whole flood relief program. So we have not gotten an accurate assessment of the health risk. I remember one person from the medical counselor, had called for an evacuation of the flooded areas, and he was severely criticized. I think the government of the day wanted to pretend things were normal, and they felt that reports of disease would create alarm and panic. So they tried to downplay the report of diseases. But we now, the coalition, when went into office, particularly last year, moved towards, in fact, the ministry was renamed Public Health Ministry to put the focus on public health, not just medical issues. And we started to turn the whole focus of health in Guyana towards public health, because we had threats of the Ebola and other transnational diseases. And we realized that the whole world was moving into an area of communicable diseases which we weren't prepared for. That's why we call the Ministry of Public Health. And luckily now we have, because of the coalition's foresight, we have a Center for Disease Control on the East Coast, MRR. But the diseases which occurred in 2005 were perhaps never fully reported on. We know of the 36 deaths, but we don't know the extent of leptospirosis, of cholera, and other gastroenteritis diseases. During the PPP era too, there were serious outbreaks in the Northwest, in the Brigadier region, around Port Kaituma, and even the Mabaroom area. People died. Maruka. Those areas are very low lying. Brigadier is a very low lying area, and if you went to Maruka or some other areas, you will see how easy it is for the waters to the areas, or the low-lying areas, for persons to be affected by waterborne diseases. And this is the problem now. In many of the areas that are flooded, people still use latrines, particularly in rural areas. So you have the danger of fecal matter floating in the area, because there's no way of control. There's no way of burying dead cattle. So the corpse, the cadavers would be floating, and all these factors could cause the water to be contaminated. Where is drinking water coming from? So we don't have to wait until people start to die of disease. We have to put measures in place. And there's no evidence, there's some advisories, boil the water, use chlorine, don't drink contaminated water, but there's water all around the place. People can't go to shops and buy bottled water, and there's no national public health plan for this particular type of situation. Yes, there's some progress made on the COVID-19 front. I think as of yesterday, the 3rd of June, we had 400 deaths. I don't think anybody could have imagined this, last year, June, 400 deaths. And heaven knows what will happen this year with this flood. It will definitely precipitate other forms of waterborne diseases. But I don't see the trace of a plan. I know advisory has been issued, but I don't know that there's a plan.
Sir, my next question is, what lessons can be learned from this administration's responses to the different communities affected by the floods? I asked that question because the administration is, we see them and they're busy, delivering household relief hampers to affected households, like I mentioned, and repairing equipment in other communities and regions. What lessons can we learn?
The PPP has a certain attitude to state power, public administration. Whether it is an emergency or not, the PPP has divided this country into red zones and green zones, red villages and green villages. And we have received complaints. Our members of parliament have complained that PPP officials are providing relief to the red villages. And they are even excluding persons associated with the opposition from participating. So the beneficiaries, except in certain token cases, have been supporters of the PPP. It's quite unfortunate, but this is what has been happening. It is some equipment which is needed to relieve flooding has been sent mainly to areas occupied by persons who the PPP feels are their supporters. So the attitude has been divisive. We're all Guyanese citizens, and all regions are suffering. And perhaps places like Region 10 are suffering more than others. Now, hampers cannot solve floods. Hampers provide short-term relief. And what we need now is a national approach to dealing with agriculture. I know that some farmers saying, look, we don't want hampers, we want to farm. We want to get our farming going again. In terms of infrastructure, hampers cannot solve infrastructural problems. There are drainage problems, canals have to be cleared, maybe new reservoirs have to be constructed. These solutions require equipment. So dividing the country into green zones and red zones, we're not running an election campaign, we're talking about national development. And things are going badly wrong already. And many of us who were around in 2005 could see the ministers going out with their rain hats and with the handing out hampers. It is a stereotype image of PPP response to flooding in Guyana. This is not a time for hampers. Hampers help. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient to deal with this catastrophe.
And sir, I would have noticed in scrolling through social media that PPP officials have been accused of having point person in communities identify PPP households so that those hampers can be given to them while other persons who are affected have not received.
It is really a social tragedy that the PPP behaves in this way. I think the COVID grant relief had to be halted because of the same accusations. It's a stereotype PPP political behavior. They will deal with their supporters first and foremost. And here we have a situation in which all of the communities are affected in all 10 regions. Well, not all of the communities. All 10 regions are affected. And we have started to receive complaints that PPP officials, even at ministerial level, are discriminating. And it is clear that some communities are not receiving the infrastructural support that they need to get the water off the land as quickly as possible.
Sir, my final question, and we can spend some time discussing this. What is necessary for solving the recurrent pattern and problems of flooding in Guyana, in the coastland and the hinterland? Natural disasters have been called acts of God and not actions of human. You would have served 5 years. You, like you mentioned, I think during your tenure you had to deal with flooding in the Rupununi. And I could remember PM Nagumutu and a team being there doing assessments, saying what is needed and so forth. What is necessary for solving this recurrent problem and the patterns?
Gabriela, we have to look at causation. We have to go back to the drawing board. To start with, there needs to be a national plan.
Yeah.
This cannot be done by, NBIA alone. This is you need a whole of country approach. And we don't have that. What causes flood in Rupununi is different from what causes floods in the coastland, for example. There's no national plan. And we must resolve now, 2021, in the middle of another flood, to have a national flood control plan, a system which could ensure that flooding or the impact or the effects of flooding are mitigated in future. This calls for a review of how we manage our regions. You cannot try to centralize everything in NBIA or 1 or 2 ministries. Every region must have the capability to respond. And in this regard, I must mention that we had set back up the Guyana People's Militia. So every region should have a company of militia which could respond promptly. You don't have to send people from Georgetown. Every region should have a warehouse with all of the equipment, supplies, cots. Now they're running around looking for cots, fresh water, and other materials which could be deployed in that region. You don't have to wait for the center. It seems as if the CDC with Colonel Craig is everywhere. He can't be everywhere. What we need is a regional system. Militia could be turned out as volunteers. Militia is not needed just for, national defense purposes, but civil defense purposes as well. And we need to have that whole of government approach. We also need to have an organization. It is clear that floods will recur in years to come. And there needs to be an organization which deals, not only have a plan, but there must be a body of people who study weather patterns, who look at coastal zone management, who look at the river systems, who look at the canals, and stop blaming city council, stop blaming the NDC. The city does not have the capability to maintain Georgetown canal infrastructure. It is too expensive. It just doesn't have the money. Central government has to help. Central government has to help with the outfalls of the major waterways. So we need an organization bigger than NDIA, which was created for different purposes. You need a national organization which goes around the country, ensuring that flood control systems are in place. You need also to have a sense of national unity because you're mobilizing the whole public. And unless you get the public to support your behavior, you will not be able to get voluntary compliance. For example, if one of the problems is keeping the canals clear, you need to have a solid waste management program in place so that solid waste could be efficiently disposed of. If people continue to throw garbage and old refrigerators into the canals, they'll be clogged up, and the canals won't be able to store the water and remove it from the land during catastrophes like this. So what we need to see is a completely different attitude to flood control in this country. We need an organization, we need a plan, we need mobilization. Most of all, you need the support of citizens of this country. And in this regard, we need to get the regions, we need to empower the regions, we need to empower the neighborhoods, we need to empower the municipalities. You cannot shut these people out, believing that everything will be managed only by a ministry of this or the ministry of that. The regional system must be made to work, and the people must be brought on board through some method of mobilization, some organization, which could overcome these political differences, these green villages and red villages, and the attitudes which have been dividing our country. There is no general plan or interest by the PPP to mobilize the whole nation to deal with what is now a national catastrophe. It is a great pity. We don't need to suffer like this, and the PPP needs to change its attitude to regional administrations, to the neighborhoods, to the municipalities, and to bringing the whole Guyanese people into an organization that could fight this recurrent flood. It's almost a pandemic, but it's a recurrent annual flood catastrophe. The PPP must do more as a government. It must develop a sense of responsibility and overcome this divisive attitude if we are to overcome this catastrophe.
Mr. Granger, thank you very much for being with me today and providing insight on this topic today. Thank you very much once again, and I look forward to having you next week. To you, our viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you a wonderful and safe weekend. On behalf of all of us here at Public Interest, we would like to encourage you to please continue to follow all COVID-19 guidelines. I'm Gabriela Patram. Goodbye.